Santa, please find my mom someone who loves her. A wish that turned into a Christmas miracle. Welcome to True Soul Narratives, where every story carries a heartbeat. Love, betrayal, kindness, forgiveness, and the courage to start again. Before we start, comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Scott Brennan sat in the oversized red velvet chair, fake white beard itching his face, listening to another child recite their Christmas wish list. He smiled mechanically, ho-ho-hoed on cue, promised to do his best. But inside he felt nothing. Just going through the motions, the way he'd been going through life for 3 years. Then a 7-year-old boy with serious brown eyes climbed onto his lap and handed him a carefully folded letter. "You have to read it," the boy said, his voice urgent and important. Every word matters. Scott opened the letter expecting the usual. Video games, remote control cars, the newest trending toy. Instead, the careful handwriting. Some words misspelled read, "Dear Santa, I don't want toys. Please find my mom someone who loves her. She cries at night when she thinks I'm asleep." Scott's breath caught. His eyes stung with tears he couldn't afford to shed in front of a child. This wasn't a normal wish. This was a 7-year-old boy trying to save his mother. He looked up at the child, watching him hopefully, then past him to where a young woman stood waiting, exhausted love written all over her face. What this child's wish revealed would connect two broken people in the most unexpected way and prove that some miracles are written by the smallest hands. But to understand this moment, to understand why a child would sacrifice his own Christmas to fix his mother's loneliness, we need to go back to 3 weeks earlier. Camila Torres was 29 years old and she was drowning. Not in water, but in exhaustion, in bills she couldn't pay, in the crushing weight of being both mother and father to a 7-year-old boy who deserves so much more than she could give him. She worked as a waitress at Rosie's Diner on 5th Street, the kind of place that smelled like burnt coffee and broken dreams, where tips were small and customers were sometimes cruel. But it was a job, and jobs were hard to come by when you had no college degree and a gap in your resume from years spent trapped in a marriage that had tried to destroy you. Max was her entire world, her son, her reason for breathing, her reason for getting up every morning even when her body screamed for rest. 2 years ago, she'd finally found the courage to leave her husband, Kevin, a man whose love had turned to control and then to violence. He'd left them with nothing when she'd filed for divorce, moved across the country, sent no child support, acted like Max didn't exist. And Camila had been left to pick up the pieces alone. She worked double shifts whenever she could, standing on her feet for 12, sometimes 14 hours a day, carrying trays and forcing smiles for people who rarely saw her as human. Their tiny one-bedroom apartment was all she could afford. Max slept in the bedroom. She slept on the pull-out couch in the living room. Christmas was coming, and Camila had $47 saved in an envelope hidden in her sock drawer. $47 to make Christmas magical for a little boy who deserved the world. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was all she had. Max deserved so much more. Deserved a mother who wasn't exhausted all the time, who could afford to buy him the toys other kids had, who could give him a childhood that wasn't marked by struggle. But all Camila could give him was love. Fierce and desperate and all-consuming, and she hid the rest. Hid the loneliness that ate at her in the quiet moments. Hid the fear that she'd never be enough, never do enough, never be the parent Max deserved. Late at night after Max fell asleep, she'd lock herself in their tiny bathroom and cry into a towel so he wouldn't hear. She hadn't dated since the divorce, couldn't imagine trusting someone again, letting someone close enough to hurt her, to hurt Max. She was too scared, too broken, too busy just surviving. Max Torres was 7 years old and he knew things children his age shouldn't have to know. He knew his mother was sad even when she smiled at him. He knew the smile didn't reach her eyes the way it used to before Dad left, before everything got hard. He heard her crying at night through the thin walls of their apartment, soft, muffled sounds she thought he couldn't hear. But he did, every single night. And it made his chest hurt in a way he didn't have words for. Max felt guilty. Guilty that his mom worked so hard just for him. Guilty that she was tired all the time. Guilty that he couldn't fix it, couldn't make her happy the way she tried to make him happy. He wanted to help, wanted to do something, anything to take away the sadness in her eyes. But he was just a kid. What could he do? Then he remembered Santa. Santa could do anything, right? Santa brought presents and made wishes come true. Max believed in Santa with the pure, unshakable faith that only children possess. This year, he didn't want toys. This year, he had one wish that mattered more than anything else in the world. 3 weeks before Christmas, Max asked his mother if they could go to see Santa at the mall. Camila could barely afford the bus fare, let alone the $5 photo package the mall Santa offered. But she looked at Max's hopeful face, those brown eyes so much like her own, and she couldn't say no. "Okay, sweetheart," she said, forcing brightness into her voice. "We'll go this weekend." They took the bus on Saturday morning after Camila's early shift ended. Max clutched a carefully written letter in his small hands. The paper folded and refolded so many times it was soft as fabric. He'd written it in secret when Camila was at work and their neighbor Mrs. Chen was watching him. He hadn't shown it to anyone. This was between him and Santa. The mall was decorated for Christmas, lights twinkling everywhere, garland wrapped around every surface, Christmas music playing from speakers hidden in the ceiling. Families walked past with shopping bags, children laughing, couples holding hands. Camila waited in the long line with Max, her feet aching from her morning shift, exhaustion pulling at her bones. She watched the other families, kids with both parents wearing new winter coats, carrying bags from expensive stores. The familiar ache settled in her chest. Not envy exactly, just the knowledge that she couldn't give Max those things. Couldn't give him the childhood other kids had. She'd never be enough. Scott Brennan was 35 years old, and he'd been dead inside for 3 years. Not literally, obviously. His heart still beat, his lungs still breathed, his body still went through the motions of living. But the part of him that felt things, that connected to the world, that found meaning in existence, had died in a hospital room 3 years ago when Anne took her last breath. Anne had been his fiancée, his everything, his reason for believing the world was fundamentally good. They'd met in law school, fallen in love over shared coffee and late-night study sessions, planned a life together that seemed perfect and inevitable. Then cancer came. Brutal, fast, merciless. She was diagnosed in March, dead by December. Scott had quit his corporate law job after she died. Couldn't find meaning in billable hours and client meetings when the person who made life worth living was gone. He'd been drifting ever since, taking odd bombs, volunteering when he could muster the energy, trying desperately to feel something other than numb. This year, he'd signed up to be a mall Santa. It was ridiculous, honestly. A 35-year-old former lawyer in a red suit and fake beard, listening to children ask for things their parents couldn't afford. But Anne had volunteered every Christmas, reading to kids at hospitals, serving meals at shelters, believing with her whole heart that small acts of kindness mattered. "Promise me you'll keep believing in magic," she'd said 2 days before she died, her voice weak but insistent. "Promise me you won't stop trying." So here he was, going through the motions, not really living, but trying to honor her memory the only way he knew how. Most of the kids were predictable. Video games, dolls, bikes, whatever was trending on YouTube that year. Easy wishes, impossible to fulfill, but easy to smile at and promise to try. Scott had been doing this for 2 weeks and every single interaction felt hollow. He was playing a part, pretending to be jolly, pretending to care. Then Max Torres climbed onto his lap. The boy was small for 7, with serious brown eyes that seemed to carry weight no child should have to carry. He didn't smile or laugh or bounce with excitement like the other kids. He just looked at Scott with an intensity that made something shift in Scott's chest. "And what would you like for Christmas, young man?" Scott asked, his voice automatic, his Santa voice practiced and hollow. Max didn't answer immediately. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a letter, folded so many times the creases were deep and worn. He placed it in Scott's hands with both of his own, like he was handing over something precious and fragile. "You have to read it carefully," Max said, his voice urgent. Every word matters, okay? Okay, Scott agreed, confused by the seriousness in this child's voice. He unfolded the letter slowly, expecting a list. Toys, games, the usual childhood wants. Instead, the careful handwriting, some words misspelled, but every letter written with obvious care, read, Dear Santa, my name is Max. I am 7. I don't want toys this year. Please find my mom, someone who loves her. She works really hard and she's really tired. I hear her crying at night when she thinks I'm asleep. She deserves someone nice who won't yell or make her sad. Someone who will help her not be so lonely. This is my only wish. Thank you. Love, Max. Scott's throat closed. His eyes burned behind the ridiculous fake beard. His hands trembled slightly as he held the letter, reading it again because surely he'd misunderstood. But no, the words were clear. A 7-year-old child asking Santa to find his mother someone to love her. Not toys, not games, not anything for himself. Just his mother's happiness. Scott looked up from the letter at Max's face. The boy was watching him with desperate hope, like Scott held the answer to the most important question in the world. Can you do it? Max asked, his voice small. Can Santa find someone for my mom? Scott glanced past Max to where a young woman stood waiting at the edge of the Santa area. She was beautiful despite the exhaustion written all over her face. Dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, waitress uniform visible under her worn jacket, eyes fixed on Max with love so fierce it was almost painful to witness. She was young, probably not even 30, but she looked tired in a way that went bone deep. And Scott knew, looking at her, that this was a woman who'd been through hell and was still fighting, still surviving, still loving her son with everything she had. Something in Scott's chest cracked open. The numbness that had protected him for 3 years suddenly felt less solid, less necessary. If you're moved by stories of pure love and unexpected miracles, subscribe to True Soul Narratives for more heartwarming tales that remind us why hope matters. I'll do my very best, Scott promised Max, his voice rough with emotion he hadn't felt in years. Max's face lit up. He wrapped his small arms around Scott's neck in a fierce hug. Well, thank you, Santa. She's really the best mom ever. Then he scrambled down and ran back to his mother, who crouched down to his level with a tired smile. What did you ask for? She asked, ruffling his hair with obvious affection. It's a secret, Max said, glancing back at Scott with a small, knowing smile. Scott watched them walk away, mother and son, hands clasped, disappearing into the crowd of Christmas shoppers. The letter was still in his hands, the paper soft and worn from Max's constant folding. He read it again, and as he sat there in that ridiculous red suit for the first time in 3 years, Scott Brennan felt something. Not the crushing grief that had defined him, not the numbness that had protected him, but something new, something that felt dangerously close to purpose. That night, Scott sat alone in his apartment, the letter spread on his kitchen table under the harsh fluorescent light. He'd read it so many times the words were burned into his memory, but he kept reading anyway. Dear Santa, my name is Max. I am 7. I don't want toys this year. Please find my mom, someone who loves her. The careful handwriting, some letters backwards, some words misspelled. The way Max had written mum instead of mom, because that's probably how Camila said it, with that slight accent Scott had noticed. She works really hard and she's really tired. I hear her crying at night when she thinks I'm asleep. Scott's chest ached. This 7-year-old child was carrying his mother's pain, trying to fix something no child should have to fix. She deserves someone nice who won't yell or make her sad. That line told him everything. Max's father had been cruel. The fear in that simple sentence spoke volumes. Someone who will help her not be so lonely. This is my only wish. Scott knew this was crazy. He was sitting in his apartment at midnight, obsessing over a letter from a child he didn't know, thinking about a woman he'd seen for 30 seconds. This wasn't normal. This wasn't rational. He should fold the letter, put it away, forget about it the way he'd forgotten about hundreds of other Santa requests. But he couldn't, because he'd been dead inside for 3 years, going through motions, pretending to live while feeling nothing. And for the first time since Anne took her last breath in that sterile hospital room, Scott felt something. Not the crushing grief that had defined him, not the numbness that had protected him, but something else. A pull, a purpose, a reason to try. He thought about Anne's last words. Promise me you'll keep believing in magic. Promise me you won't stop trying. And something else she'd said months before the diagnosis, back when they'd been planning their wedding and their future. The right person will find you when you're ready to be found. Scott had thought she meant him, thought she was talking about how they'd found each other. But maybe she'd meant something else. Maybe she'd been preparing him for the moment it or when he'd be ready to live again. Is this what she meant? Was this insane moment, sitting here with a child's letter, actually the universe answering a promise he'd made to a dying woman? Scott made a decision. Not a rational one, not one he could explain to anyone without sounding unhinged, but a decision nonetheless. He was going to find them, not to fulfill some magical Christmas wish that would be presumptuous and impossible, but because something deep inside him, something that had been silent for 3 years, was telling him he needed to, that this mattered, that maybe, just maybe, this was how he'd start living again. The next day was Scott's day off from the mall. He drove back anyway, parking in the lot, walking through the crowds of Christmas shoppers with Max's letter folded in his jacket pocket. He talked to other Santa volunteers first. Hey, you know that kid from yesterday? 7 years old, brown hair, came with his mom. They looked at him like he was crazy. Dozens of kids come through every day, man. How would we remember one? Scott tried security next, wandered the mall until he found guards on duty, asked casually, carefully, trying not to sound like a stalker. You guys see a woman and a little boy here yesterday? She's about 30, works as a waitress, I think. The kid's 7. One guard, older guy with kind eyes, paused. The woman and kid? They take the bus, come here every year around Christmas. I've seen them. Scott's heart hammered. Do you know where they're from? The guard studied him suspiciously. Why? Scott scrambled for an explanation that didn't sound insane. The kid left something at the Santa station. I'm trying to return it. Not entirely a lie. Max had left something. His wish, his hope, his heart. The guard relaxed slightly. She works at Rosie's Diner on 5th Street. I've seen her there when I grab lunch. I think she does the evening shift most days. Scott thanked him, tried to keep his voice casual, tried to ignore the way his hands were shaking. He drove to Rosie's Diner that evening, parked across the street where he could see through the large front windows. Felt like a creep, sitting there in his car, watching. But he couldn't make himself leave. And then he saw her, Camila, moving between tables with practiced efficiency, coffee pot in hand, forced smile on her tired face. She wore the standard waitress uniform, her dark hair pulled back, her movements quick and competent despite obvious exhaustion. Max sat in a corner booth exactly where Scott could see him through the window. Homework spread on the table, pencil in hand, occasionally looking up to watch his mother work, waiting for her shift to end. This was their life. This is what Max saw every day. His mother working herself to exhaustion while he did homework in a diner booth because they had nowhere else to go. Scott sat in his car for over an hour watching, trying to figure out what to do. You can't just walk up to a stranger and say your son wished for me to love you. That was insane. That was the kind of thing that got restraining orders filed. That was crossing every boundary of normal human behavior. But sitting here doing nothing felt impossible too. Anne's voice echoed in his mind. That conversation they'd had 6 months before she got sick. They'd been walking through a park, talking about nothing and everything, and she'd said something that stuck with him. Life is short, Scott, shorter than we think. Take the chances that matter. Don't wait for perfect timing, because perfect never comes. If something feels right, be brave enough to reach for it. At the time, he'd thought she was talking about their wedding, about not waiting, about moving forward with their plans. Now he wondered if she'd somehow known, if some part of her had been preparing him for this moment, 3 years later, sitting in a car outside a diner, holding a letter from a child who believed in miracles. Scott watched Camila refill a customer's coffee, saw her smile even though her feet had to be killing her, saw the way she glanced at Max every few minutes to make sure he was okay, and he made a decision. He couldn't walk in there and tell her the truth. Not yet, maybe not ever. But he could walk in there as a customer. He could sit in her section, order coffee, leave a good tip. He could be kind without being creepy. He could see if this pull he felt was real or just the desperate grasping of a lonely man looking for meaning. Scott took a deep breath, folded Max's letter carefully and put it back in his pocket, and got out of the car. The bell above the diner door chimed as he walked in. The smell of coffee and grease and something baking hit him immediately. The place was half full, working-class people grabbing dinner, a few solo diners reading newspapers. Camila looked up from the counter, saw a new customer, and grabbed a menu. Her smile was automatic, professional, didn't reach her eyes. "Sit anywhere you'd like," she said, her voice tired but polite. Scott chose a booth near where Max sat, close enough to see them but not so close it was obvious. Camila brought him a menu and a glass of water, still not really seeing him, just going through the motions of her job. "What can I get you? Coffee?" Scott said, "and whatever the special is." She nodded, turned away, and Scott sat there feeling like he'd just stepped off a cliff into open air, not knowing if he'd fly or fall. Scott became a regular at Rosie's Diner. Not in an obsessive way, or at least that's what he told himself. Just coffee in the morning before his Santa shift. Lunch on his days off. Dinner sometimes when the loneliness in his apartment felt too heavy. Always sitting in Camila's section. Always leaving tips that were far too generous for a cup of coffee and a plate of eggs. $20 for a $6 meal. $30 for breakfast. He watched her eyes widen the first few times. Watched her try to give the money back. "This is too much," she'd say, but he'd already be walking out the door. "Keep it. You earned it." He made small talk, but never pushy, never invasive, just kind. "How's your day going? Busy shift?" He remembered details. She'd mentioned Max had a spelling test on Tuesday, so on Wednesday Scott asked how it went. She'd said the coffee machine at home broke, so he brought her a thermos of good coffee from the shop down the street. Not as a gift, just as a "hey, thought you might need this." Camila noticed. Of course she noticed. But she didn't know what to make of it. Max noticed too. "That man comes here a lot," he told his mother one evening while doing homework in his usual corner booth. Camila glanced over at Scott, who was reading a newspaper and drinking coffee like he had nowhere else to be. "He's just a regular customer, sweetheart." But she'd noticed him too. Noticed his kind eyes. Noticed his genuine smile that reached all the way to those eyes, not the fake customer service smile she wore every day. Noticed that he was the first man in 2 years who'd looked at her with something that felt like respect. Not hunger, not judgment, just respect. One evening, about a week after Scott had started coming regularly, he was there when Max was struggling with math homework. The boy's face was scrunched in frustration, eraser shavings covering the table, near tears over fractions that wouldn't make sense. Scott watched from his booth, remembering being 7 and hating math. Remembering Anne helping him years later when he was studying for the bar exam and statistics were eating him alive. He stood up, walked over slowly so as not to startle them. "Excuse me," he said gently. "I couldn't help noticing you're working on fractions. I'm pretty good with numbers, if you'd like some help." "Only if it's okay with ship mom," he added quickly, looking at Camila, who'd appeared at his elbow with a coffee pot. Camila hesitated. Every instinct she'd developed over 2 years of being a single mother screamed stranger danger. Don't let men near your son. Don't trust. Don't let your guard down. But something about Scott felt different, felt safe, and Max was on the verge of a meltdown over homework that was due tomorrow. "Just for a minute," she agreed, her voice cautious. Scott slid into the booth across from Max and looked at the worksheet. "Fractions, huh? Tricky stuff. But I'll let you in on a secret. They're just pizza." Max blinked, confused. "Pizza?" Scott grabbed a napkin and drew a circle. "If you have one pizza and you cut it into 4 pieces, each piece is 1/4, right?" Max nodded slowly. Scott kept going, patient and clear, breaking down the concepts into things a 7-year-old could visualize. Camila wiped tables nearby, listening, watching how gentle Scott was with her son, how he never made Max feel stupid, just guided him toward understanding. "You're really smart," Max said when he finally got the answer right. "Are you a teacher?" Scott smiled, something sad flickering behind it. "I used to be a lawyer, but I'm figuring out what I want to be now." Camilla filed that information away. A lawyer, former lawyer, someone who'd walked away from a career, just like she'd walked away from a marriage. Someone who was rebuilding. Over the next week, Scott kept coming, kept being kind, kept leaving those generous tips that Camilla knew she should refuse but desperately needed, kept helping Max with homework when the boy was struggling, kept existing in their orbit like he belonged there, like he'd always been there. Until finally, 1 week before Christmas, the diner was nearly empty. Just Scott, Camilla, Max, and one old man reading a newspaper in the corner. Max was coloring a Christmas picture, tongue stuck out in concentration, crayons spread across the table. Scott was finishing his coffee, and Camilla, refilling his cup for the third time, finally asked the question that had been burning in her mind for days. "Why do you come here so much?" The words came out more blunt than she'd intended. Scott looked up at her, and she saw him make a decision, saw him choose honesty over deflection. "Because 3 weeks ago, a little boy gave me a letter at the mall." Camilla froze, coffee pot suspended in midair. "What?" Scott reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a piece of paper, worn soft from being carried everywhere, folded and unfolded countless times. He handed it to her. Camilla set down the coffee pot with shaking hands and unfolded the letter. She recognized Max's handwriting immediately. The careful letters, some backwards, some misspelled. "Dear Santa, my name is Max. I am 7. I don't want toys this year." Camilla's vision blurred as she read, "Please find my mom, someone who loves her. She works really hard and she's really tired. I hear her crying at night when she thinks I'm asleep." Tears spilled down her cheeks, hot and unstoppable. She deserves someone nice who won't yell or make her sad. Someone who will help her not be so lonely. "This is my only wish." Her son, her baby, had given up his Christmas wish for her, had heard her crying through walls she thought were thick enough, had carried her loneliness on his 7-year-old shoulders. "You're the Santa," she whispered, looking up at Scott through her tears. "I am," he confirmed quietly. "And you came here because of this?" Camilla's voice broke. Scott leaned forward, his expression open and honest and vulnerable in a way that made Camilla's breath catch. "I came here because that letter broke my heart open. Because I've been going through life like a ghost for 3 years. My fiancée died. Cancer. And after she died, I stopped believing in anything that mattered. Stopped living. Just existed. But your son believes in magic and miracles and Santa Claus. And he loves you so much that he'd give up his own Christmas wish just to see you happy. That kind of love deserves to be honored." Camilla was crying openly now, not even trying to hide it anymore. Scott continued, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I'm not here to fulfill some magical wish. I can't make that kind of promise. But I'm here because I wanted to meet the woman who raised a child that selfless, that loving, that brave. And because maybe, just maybe, I'm ready to start living again." He paused, looking at her with eyes that had seen loss and grief and were choosing hope anyway. "And maybe you are too." Camilla sat down heavily in the booth across from him, Max's letter still clutched in her shaking hands. "I can't," she said, the words forced through tears. "I can't let someone in. My ex-husband destroyed me. Hurt me in ways I'm still trying to heal from. I barely survived leaving him. And I can't risk Max getting hurt if it doesn't work out. I can't put him through that." Scott nodded, no judgment in his expression, just understanding. "I'm not asking for anything," he said gently. "I'm just asking for a chance to know you. No pressure, no expectations, no promises of forever or declarations of love. Just let me be your friend. And if it becomes more, we'll figure it out together. But if it doesn't, that's okay too. I'll still be grateful to have known you." Camilla looked over at Max, coloring peacefully, humming a Christmas carol off-key, completely unaware of the conversation happening a few feet away. She thought about all the nights she'd cried alone in the bathroom, all the times she'd felt crushed by loneliness and exhaustion and the weight of doing everything alone, all the fear that had kept her isolated for 2 years. And she thought about Scott, about his kindness over the past weeks, about the way he looked at her like she was worth something, about the way he helped Max without being asked, about the fact that he'd carried her son's letter in his pocket for weeks, had tracked her down not to fulfill some fantasy, but just to try, just to see, just to be brave when being brave felt impossible. Okay, she whispered, the word barely audible. Just friends. For now. Scott's face broke into a genuine smile, the first real one she'd seen from him. Just friends, he agreed. For now. And across the diner, Max looked up from his coloring, saw his mom smiling through tears, saw the nice man smiling back. And something in his 7-year-old heart knew. Santa had heard his wish after all. Over the next 2 weeks, Scott and Camila grew closer in the careful way that people who've been broken learn to trust again. Scott came to the diner every day, sometimes twice. He helped Max with homework, patiently explaining long division and spelling words, never rushing, never frustrated. He took them to free Christmas events around the city, things Camila couldn't afford on her own. The tree lighting in the town square where Max's eyes went wide with wonder. Caroling in the park where they sang off-key and laughed. The Christmas market where they walked through stalls, drinking hot chocolate Scott had bought. He never pushed, never demanded more than Camila was ready to give. Just present, just there, just showing up. Max adored him. Started calling him Mr. Scott with a formality that made Scott's heart ache in the best way. And Camila felt herself softening. The walls she'd built so carefully, so necessarily, were cracking. She was trusting again, hoping again, terrified but doing it anyway. One night after Max had fallen asleep on her couch during a movie, Camila and Scott sat in her tiny kitchen drinking tea, and she told him everything. About Kevin, her ex-husband, about the yelling that turned to pushing, that turned to hitting, about the fear that lived in her bones even now, 2 years later, about being so lonely she sometimes forgot what it felt like to be seen as human instead of just a body that served food. Scott listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't try to fix it, didn't offer empty platitudes. He just held her hand across the table and let her speak. When she finished, her eyes red and swollen, he said the only thing that mattered. You survived. You got yourself and Max out. You rebuilt from nothing. You're the strongest person I've ever met. And Camila, who'd spent years believing she was weak for staying, for not leaving sooner, for still being scared, finally believed that maybe strength looked different than she'd thought. Maybe strength was surviving. Maybe strength was still being here. Christmas Eve arrived cold and bright. Scott invited them to his apartment for dinner, his voice nervous over the phone like he was asking something much bigger than a meal. Camila almost said no. It felt too intimate, too much like a real relationship, too scary. But Max overheard and his face lit up with such excitement that she couldn't refuse. They went over that evening. Camila carrying a store-bought pie she'd splurged on, Max clutching a drawing he'd made for Mr. Scott. Scott's apartment was modest, smaller than Camila expected for a former lawyer. But it was warm, lived in, and photos of Anne were everywhere. On the mantle, on the bookshelf, on the refrigerator. Scott hadn't hidden his past, hadn't pretended the woman he'd loved didn't exist. And somehow that made Camila feel safer, knowing he honored what he'd lost instead of running from it. They cooked together, the three of them crammed in Scott's small kitchen. Max stood on a chair helping stir sauce, getting flour everywhere, laughing when Scott pretended to be mad. They ate at the tiny table, knees bumping, passing dishes, talking over each other. It felt like family, like something Camila had forgotten existed. After dinner, while Camila was cleaning dishes, Max approached Scott with a serious expression. Mr. Scott, do you know Santa? Scott smiled, drying a plate. I might have a way to contact him. Why? Max glanced at his mother, then back at Scott. I want to tell him thank you. My wish came true. Camilla's hands stilled in the soapy water. Scott's throat tightened. What wish? Camilla asked gently, turning around. Max looked between them, his 7-year-old face so earnest it hurt. I asked Santa to find you someone who loves you, he pointed at Scott. And he did. Camilla and Scott locked eyes across the small kitchen, both of them tearing up, both of them understanding what this child had done, how his pure, selfless love had brought two broken people together, how his wish had created something none of them had dared to hope for. Camilla crouched down to Max's level, pulling him into a hug, crying into his hair. Max squirmed. Mom, you're squishing me. She laughed through her tears. I love you so much, baby. I know, Max said simply. That's why I made the wish. After Max fell asleep on Scott's couch, exhausted from excitement and cookies, Camilla and Scott sat together on the floor beside the small Christmas tree Scott had put up more out of obligation than joy. Until now. Until them. I haven't felt this way since Anne, Scott admitted quietly, his voice raw with honesty. I thought I'd never love anyone again. Thought that part of me died with her. But you and Max, he paused, searching for words. You've reminded me what it means to be alive. Not just existing, not just going through motions, but actually living, feeling, hoping. Camilla's eyes filled with tears. I'm terrified, she whispered. Me too, Scott said, taking her hand. But maybe that's okay. Maybe we can be terrified together. Maybe that's what love is after loss. Not the absence of fear, but the courage to try anyway. Camilla looked at him, this man who'd tracked her down because of a child's letter, who'd shown up every day, who'd been patient and kind and present. And she leaned forward and kissed him. Soft, tentative, healing. Scott kissed her back, gentle and careful, like she was precious. They were both crying, both hopeful, both finally believing that maybe, just maybe, they deserved this. Deserved happiness. Deserved love. Deserved the family they were building from broken pieces. Christmas morning came bright and early, heralded by Max's excited shouting. It's Christmas! Wake up! Scott had let them stay over. Camilla in his bed while he took the couch, everything proper and respectful. But now they all stumbled into the living room, Max racing ahead. Under Scott's small tree were presents, wrapped in slightly crooked paper because Scott had never been good at wrapping. Max dove for them, reading tags. This one's for me. This one's for Mom. They're from Santa. Camilla looked at Scott, who shrugged with feigned innocence. Santa must have found us. Max tore into his presents, a new backpack he'd needed for school, books he'd mentioned wanting, art supplies, practical toys that showed someone had been paying attention. For Camilla, a new winter coat because hers was held together with safety pins, gift cards for groceries, small things that mattered more than diamonds. Then Max found a small box tucked behind the tree. For Mom and Mr. Scott, it says. He handed it to Camilla with reverent care. She opened it slowly. Inside were two ornaments, shaped like hearts, delicate and matching. A note in handwriting that looked suspiciously like Max's, but neater, like someone had helped. For your family tree. Love, Santa. Max grinned, bouncing with barely contained excitement. See? Santa knows you're supposed to be together, Camilla laughed through tears, holding the ornaments like they were made of something more precious than glass. Scott pulled her close, kissed the top of her head. Smart kid you've got there, he murmured. The smartest, Camilla agreed. If this story reminded you that the purest love comes from the smallest hearts, subscribe to True Soul Narratives for more tales of hope, healing, and Christmas miracles. 1 year later, Christmas morning looked different. A new apartment, bigger, with 3 bedrooms. One for Max, one for Scott and Camilla, one for guests they didn't have yet, but hoped for someday. Scott and Camilla had gotten married in a simple ceremony in the spring, Max standing between them as ring bearer, grinning so wide his face hurt. It's Christmas, Max yelled, bursting into their bedroom at an ungodly hour. Some things never change. They stumbled to the living room, tree covered in ornaments, including 2 heart-shaped ones from last year hanging side by side, and a new one Max had made in school. 3 figures holding hands, painted carefully. Caption read in Max's improving handwriting, Our forever, Max, Mum, and Dad. Max had stopped calling him Mr. Scott months ago, had started saying Dad cautiously at first, testing the word. Scott had cried the first time, held Max tight and whispered, I'm honored. Now it was natural, easy, real. Scott scooped Max up, the boy getting too big for this but still allowing it on Christmas. Kissed Camila, who was crying again because she always cried on Christmas now, but happy tears. Thank you for the best wish ever, buddy, Scott said to Max. Max, wise beyond his 8 years now, grinned. I didn't make the wish, Santa did. They laughed, the three of them, their little family built from a child's pure love and a stranger's brave heart. Built from grief and survival and the courage to hope when hope seemed impossible. And somewhere in whatever place exists beyond this one, Anne smiled, because she'd always believed in magic. And she'd always known that love, real love, never really dies. It just finds new ways to bloom. Sometimes miracles don't come from magic. They come from the courage to hope when hope seems impossible, from a child who loved his mother enough to sacrifice his own wishes, and from two broken people who found healing in each other. This Christmas, believe in the impossible, because the smallest wishes can create the biggest miracles. What would you wish for someone you love? Let us know in the comments and rate this story from 0 to 10. And remember, sometimes the greatest gifts aren't wrapped in paper. They're wrapped in courage, hope, and a 7-year-old's careful handwriting.